Could you imagine navigating a romantic landscape so strictly governed by bureaucratic monks that sharing a bed with your own spouse on the wrong day of the week could land you before a judge? Stepping away from the modern world, we find ourselves standing on the edge of a quiet 13th century village, just as the golden hue of dusk settles over the thatched roofs. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. It is so wonderful to have you joining us on this journey back in time. And if you enjoy these peaceful strolls through history, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our little community. I am always genuinely curious, so please let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight and what time it is for you right now. As the evening chill sets in and the villagers retreat to their hearths, I invite you to settle in, get as comfortable as you can, and let the centuries simply melt away. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we explore the bizarre rules of medieval love and courtship. The village at twilight is a place of deep shadows and quiet routines. Listen closely to the sounds around you. You can hear the soft, rhythmic crunch of leather boots on frost-hardened mud. It is the sound of weary laborers returning from the fields. In this era, 85 to 90% of the European population lives in rural, agrarian peasant communities. Their lives are tied entirely to the land. They are bound to the soil and the changing seasons. They know nothing of sprawling cities or vast kingdoms. Their entire universe is this small collection of humble dwellings. They plow the earth, sow the seeds, and harvest the crops in a never-ending cycle of survival. Let us look closer at these homes. The standard peasant dwelling is known as a crackhouse. It is built with heavy, curved timber frames hauled from the nearby forests. The walls are made of wattle and daub. This is a meticulously woven lattice of wooden strips coated with a thick, sticky mixture of wet soil, river clay, and dry straw. It is a simple but incredibly effective barrier against the biting winter wind. From beneath the heavy wooden doors, a warm, flickering amber glow spills out into the gathering darkness. This soft light invites us to peer inside and understand their daily existence. Step across the threshold. You will quickly find that homes are typically single-room structures. Entire families cook, eat, and sleep together in this one shared space. There are no separate bedrooms. There are no private parlors or quiet studies. The concept of personal privacy simply does not exist in the medieval mindset. Communal living is an absolute matter of physical survival. They huddle together to share limited resources, sparse food, and essential body heat. Every conversation is overheard. Every argument is public. Every quiet moment is shared with siblings, parents, and grandparents. In the bitter, freezing months of winter, they are not alone. Farm animals, such as valuable pigs and restless chickens, often share the indoor living space. They are brought inside out of sheer necessity. The animals provide crucial shared body heat that helps keep the human occupants alive through the freezing nights. It is a crowded, noisy, and pungent environment, but to the medieval peasant, it is entirely normal and deeply comforting. Look up toward the center of the darkroom. The hearth is situated right in the middle of the packed dirt floor. There is no stone chimney to draw the thick smoke away. Instead, the smoke drifts slowly upward. It lingers in the rafters and filters gently through the thick, thatched roof. The rich, earthy aroma of burning peat and wood smoke hangs heavy in the crisp night air. This pervasive scent seeps deeply into their woven clothes and their unwashed hair. It is the undeniable, defining scent of medieval domestic life. As the night deepens, the darkness inside the Cruck house becomes profound. Artificial light is incredibly expensive and rare. Common peasants cannot afford the bright, clean, burning beeswax candles. Those luxurious items are strictly reserved for the wealthy nobles and the high altars of the church. Instead, the poor rely entirely on rushlights. These are simply long, dried rushes harvested from the riverbank and dipped repeatedly in leftover animal fat. They provide a weak, sputtering, and greasy flame. This feeble light casts long, dancing shadows against the rough wattle and daub walls. Suddenly, a sound cuts through the quiet murmurs of the village. It is the low, resonant hum of the distant parish church bell echoing across the dark valley. This is the Vespers bell. It is the ultimate timekeeper of the peasant world. The ringing dictates the absolute end of the grueling agricultural workday. It tells them exactly when to drop their heavy iron tools. It commands them to pray, to eat, and to finally rest. It is a constant, ringing reminder of the church's supreme authority in their daily lives. With the workday officially over, the tired family prepares for sleep. Listen to the soft, muffled rustle of dry straw being fluffed and prepared for the night's rest. Elevated wooden beds are a tremendous, unimaginable luxury. Most peasants sleep on simple straw pallets laid directly on the cold dirt or stone floor. They wrap themselves tightly in coarse, scratchy woolen blankets. They sleep closely, pressed together, to ward off the creeping dampness of the earth. When you step back outside into the cool night air, you can see how tightly packed the community truly is. The physical layout of these ancient villages is highly nucleated. This means the humble houses are built very close together. They are clustered tightly around a central green or the towering parish church. Everyone knows everyone else's business. Nosy neighbors can easily hear through the thin, mud-plastered walls. They know exactly what is happening next door at all hours. In such cramped, intensely communal conditions, strict social rules are not just an arbitrary luxury. They are an absolute, critical necessity to maintain social harmony and prevent violent chaos. But this was only the physical reality of their cramped world. We must also understand the landscape of their minds. We often carry a distinct, romanticized image of this era. Modern pop culture frequently tells us the Middle Ages were a time of unrestrained, chaotic passions. We imagine a lawless time filled with barbaric freedom, wild romance, and violent sword fights. We incorrectly call it the Dark Ages, but modern historians entirely reject this outdated term. They view this era as one of profound legal complexity and massive administrative development. It was not a time of lawless chaos. It was a highly structured society, utterly obsessed with order, written law, and the strict theological regulation of the frail human body. The wealthy, secular lords and powerful kings handled worldly matters of property, taxation, and physical violence. But the powerful church claimed a far more intimate and terrifying territory. They claimed exclusive, unquestionable jurisdiction over the immortal souls and the private bedrooms of the entire populace. The church possessed its own vast, parallel legal system. This was known as canon law. It strictly governed all moral, sexual, and marital affairs across the continent. It was a sprawling, terrifying web of intricate regulations. In the mid-12th century, a brilliant scholar named Gratian sought to organize this overwhelming chaos. Around the year 1140, he meticulously compiled the Decretum. This was a monumental, heavy textbook of immense legal power. It standardized thousands of fragmented, completely contradictory church laws into one comprehensive, unified code. It was a massive, exhausting undertaking. Picture a quiet, freezing, dimly lit monastic scriptorium. Breathe in the heavy, dusty scent of old parchment and dried ink. Listen to the sharp, rhythmic scratch of a sharpened quill pen recording these local laws by the flickering candlelight. This lonely room is where the ironclad rules of human love were written. They were not written by passionate poets or romantic troubadours. They were written by meticulous, austere, and deeply celibate scholars. And these rules were strictly, sometimes brutally, enforced. In the monumental year of 1215, the Great Fourth Lateran Council convened in Rome. This historic gathering established sweeping, permanent new rules for the institution of marriage. It transformed marriage from a simple, informal civil arrangement into a highly regulated, deeply sacred sacrament. The Church took absolute, total control of human courtship and wedlock. They were deeply concerned with all matters of the human flesh. The powerful Church viewed the physical body with intense, unrelenting suspicion. This dark view was heavily influenced by the early writings of St. Augustine. He linked physical desire and passion directly to original sin and the fall of humanity. To the medieval theologian, the human body was a dangerous, leaky vessel. It was entirely prone to demonic corruption and worldly temptation. Therefore, it had to be managed with strict, unyielding, and constant discipline. This harsh discipline applied to absolutely everyone, even the holy clergy. We might incorrectly assume that priests were always celibate throughout history, but local clergy were not always celibate in the early Middle Ages. Many rural priests had loving wives, large families, and comfortable homes. However, the sweeping Gregorian reforms of the 11th century changed everything forever. These aggressive reforms strictly enforced mandatory clerical celibacy across the entire continent. The powerful men enforcing the rules of marriage were now completely, legally forbidden from ever partaking in it. Hear the heavy, rhythmic clatter of a carved wooden rosary swinging against a coarse woolen monastic habit. It is the sound of ascetic, lonely dedication. It is the sound of men who have forcefully turned their backs on the comforts of physical love. But how did the common, uneducated peasant actually learn these intricate, confusing rules? Literacy was incredibly low among the rural, hard-working peasantry. They could not read Gratian's complex Decretum. They could not study the Latin decrees of the distant Lateran Council. So, the complex rules were communicated directly through loud, weekly sermons. The local parish priest would stand high before his humble flock. Imagine his solemn, echoing voice delivering a terrifying sermon in the freezing cold morning air. He would thunder aggressively against the wicked sins of the flesh. He would detail the complex, baffling rules of proper courtship. These frightening messages were also constantly reinforced visually. The Church effectively used highly visual, dramatic art to educate the illiterate, fearful masses. Look up at the colorful, intimidating frescoes painted directly on the cold stone walls of the local parish church. They vividly depict the glorious, glowing rewards of pure virtue and the horrifying, fiery torments of lustful sin. These terrifying images burned themselves permanently into the anxious minds of the simple villagers. The local parish priests acted as the front-line enforcers of this strict canon law. They served as comforting spiritual guides, but they were also diligent, bureaucratic informants. They watched their trusting parishioners incredibly closely. They knew exactly who was secretly courting whom. They knew precisely who was misbehaving in the dark shadows of the village, and they dutifully reported these moral infractions to the higher authorities. When these strict rules were broken, the frightened villagers faced the terrifying church courts. These local courts kept meticulous, obsessive records. They wrote absolutely everything down on long, winding parchment rolls. They documented even the most mundane, petty village disputes over broken romantic promises and failed, tearful betrothals. Every whispered vow, every stolen kiss, and every secret gift could suddenly become a serious matter of public, legal scrutiny. It was a terrifying labyrinth of complex law, and every young, hopeful couple had to navigate it carefully if they ever wished to safely marry. So how did these highly monitored, anxious couples actually manage to meet and marry? We must completely abandon our modern, romantic notions of spontaneous passion and love at first sight. Romance was absolutely not the primary goal of a medieval union. Marriages among the hard-working peasantry were largely practical, calculated, and cold economic alliances. They were specifically designed to consolidate small strips of land, share vital iron farming tools, or secure much-needed agricultural labor. A strong, broad back and a good set of heavy plows were far more attractive than sweet poetry or a handsome, smiling face. Daily survival was a difficult, communal effort, and marriage was considered the ultimate, necessary economic partnership for survival. Technically, the distant church demanded absolute mutual consent. Forced marriages at sword point were entirely illegal under strict church law. A man and a woman had to freely, verbally choose each other, but this was merely the official theory. The daily reality in the village was far more complex and difficult. The invisible familial pressure was absolutely immense. Parents, older siblings, and even nosy village elders weighed in heavily on every single potential match. The delicate survival of the entire family unit depended heavily on making a very good, profitable alliance. A young peasant girl might not be literally forced to the church altar by a drawn sword, but she constantly faced the crushing, invisible, and suffocating weight of her family's desperate expectations. The financial negotiations surrounding these practical unions were incredibly detailed and often bitter. The two families had to formally agree on the exact transfer of meager wealth. This complex process involved the careful calculation of the dowry and the dower. The dowry was the physical property or worldly goods brought by the young bride to the new marriage. It could be a few hidden silver coins, a warm woolen blanket, or perhaps a highly prized milking cow. The dower was the specific property promised by the older groom. This was intended to legally support his new bride in the very likely, tragic event of his early death. These crucial terms were meticulously, aggressively negotiated. Picture the tense, quiet, whispered negotiations between weathered village elders standing by the mossy village well. They argue endlessly over every single copper coin and every heavy sack of winter grain. What happened if a young, foolish couple actually fell in love against their stubborn family's wishes? They could bravely attempt a secret, clandestine marriage, by hurriedly exchanging private vows in secret and physically consummating the union in the dark. They created a valid, legally unbreakable marriage in the rigid eyes of God. But this was an incredibly risky, dangerous path. Clandestine marriages were highly discouraged and deeply hated. The powerful church hated them because they completely bypassed strict parental authority and safe public scrutiny. If caught, the terrified couple would be severely punished by the ruthless church courts. They might easily face painful public whipping or financially ruinous heavy fines. Therefore, most acceptable courtship occurred safely in the wide open. It happened directly under the watchful, judgmental eyes of the entire community. Young men and women mingled casually during times of heavy communal labor. They flirted softly while bringing in the golden autumn harvest. Or they met joyfully at the local village alehouse after a long, exhausting week of brutal toil. Step into the warm, bustling, noisy tavern. The thick air is heavy with the sweet, fermented smell of warm ale spilled casually on rough wooden tavern tables. Listen to the boisterous, chaotic, and happy chatter of the crowded, smoky room. Amidst the loud laughter and the plucking music, young, hopeful eyes slowly meet. Shy glances are quietly exchanged over carved wooden tankards of dark beer. If a potential match seemed favorable and profitable, they officially entered a formal betrothal period. A very common medieval practice was the concept of hand fasting. This was absolutely not a wild pagan ritual, but a legally recognized, highly formal promise to wed in the future. This long period of testing and financial preparation could easily last a full year and a day. It gave the anxious couple crucial time to gather meager resources, buy tools, and build a humble home. During this long courtship, small gifts were often exchanged. But these were absolutely not merely sweet romantic gestures. They were highly dangerous, legally binding tokens of intent. A young man might nervously press a simple dyed ribbon or a beautifully carved wooden spoon into a girl's calloused hand. Feel the cold glint of a small, polished silver coin pressed firmly into a rough, working hand. If she foolishly accepted it, she was legally accepting his formal promise of marriage. These simple, everyday items were incredibly important evidence. A forgotten, dusty ribbon could actually be submitted to a judge as hard, undeniable evidence of a broken promise in a terrifying church court. Before any final vows could ever be spoken, there was one final, absolutely terrifying bureaucratic hurdle: the dreaded consanguinity laws. The medieval church was deeply, obsessively paranoid about the sins of incest. Initially, the strict laws were incredibly, impossibly rigid. You could not legally marry anyone related to you within 7 long degrees of kinship. In a small, totally isolated peasant village, where the same few families had intermarried for countless centuries, this was nearly mathematically impossible. Almost everyone in the village was at least a distant cousin. The frustrated church eventually recognized this sheer administrative absurdity. In the monumental, historic year of 1215, they finally realized the rigid 7-degree rule was entirely unworkable for normal people. They officially, mercifully, reduced the strict ban to only 4 degrees. This meant you could not marry your third cousins. This small change made finding a suitable partner slightly easier, but it was still a massive bureaucratic nightmare for everyone involved. To definitively prove they were not secretly related, the anxious couple had to rely entirely on the local parish priest. Calculating complex kinship required the use of complex, confusing charts known as trees of consanguinity. Imagine the intricate, sprawling, branch-like drawings on a dry, dusty parchment chart of tangled family lineages. The frustrated priest would carefully trace the long, confusing lines of descent with his ink-stained finger. He would hunt desperately for shared common ancestors. Only after the exhausted priest had meticulously checked the chart and officially confirmed the couple was legally permitted to wed, could the joyful wedding preparations finally begin. The day of the long-awaited wedding has finally arrived. The sleepy village awakens early with a sense of rare, vibrant, and joyful excitement. But if you expect to see the happy couple walking gracefully down the long, sweeping aisle of a grand stone cathedral, you must radically adjust your modern vision. Surprisingly, the actual marriages of this era did not take place inside the Holy Church at all. Until the much later Middle Ages, the actual legal marriage ceremony took place outside. It occurred specifically at the covered church porch, or right before the heavy closed front doors of the building. Why outside in the unpredictable weather? Because a medieval marriage was, above all else, a highly public legal contract. The outdoor location ensured the absolute maximum visibility for everyone. The entire gossiping village was firmly expected to attend and loudly bear witness to the spoken vows. This highly public spectacle was specifically designed to prevent any future messy disputes over the marriage's legal legitimacy. If a deceitful man ever tried to deny his lawful wife later, 50 angry neighbors could readily swear to a judge they saw him speak the binding vows. The local priest stands waiting patiently on the cold stone steps. His specific role might surprise you. His primary duty at the church door was not actually to legally marry the couple himself. In strict Catholic theology, the couple actually marries each other directly through their own mutual spoken consent. The priest's limited role was simply to witness this consent officially on behalf of the powerful church and to gently bless the new union. He is merely a divine notary, authenticating a spiritual and legal contract between two peasants. But this happy day was absolutely not a surprise to anyone in the village. The strict church demanded total, unending transparency. In 1215, the loud reading of the banns was made absolutely mandatory across Europe. A couple's clear intention to marry had to be publicly, loudly announced by the priest on 3 consecutive, busy Sundays prior to the wedding day. This long delay gave anyone in the community ample, protected time to step forward and loudly object. If a traveling man had a secret, abandoned wife in another distant town, the reading of the banns was perfectly designed to quickly expose his wicked treachery. Now, stand quietly before the grand, imposing entrance of the local parish church. Look closely at the heavy, ornate, hand-forged iron hinges of the great oak church doors. See the bright, colorful, and festive scattering of golden wheat and picked wildflowers resting lightly on the cold stone steps. This beautiful spot is where the solemn, eternal promises are finally made. Listen to the soft, melodic, chanting voice of the priest cutting sharply through the crisp, cool morning breeze. Right at the church door, the complex financial agreements are finally formalized. The nervous groom must explicitly, loudly, list the exact property he is endowing to his new bride. He speaks the important words loudly and clearly for all to hear. He points directly to specific green fields, lists a precise number of spotted livestock, or physically hands over a heavy leather pouch of silver coins. This very public, dramatic declaration officially guarantees her future financial security. It legally ensures she will not be left utterly destitute if she ever tragically becomes a lonely widow. Then comes the highly anticipated exchange of the rings. This is a delicate, deeply symbolic, and beautiful ritual. The groom takes the simple, plain metal band in his rough fingers. He does not slide it directly onto her finger, as we do today. Instead, he places it slowly and sequentially. First, he touches it gently to her thumb, speaking the holy name of the Father. Then, he moves it carefully to her index finger in the holy name of the Son. Next, he touches the long middle finger in the holy name of the Holy Ghost. Finally, with a sigh of relief, he slides the ring to rest permanently on her fourth finger. This highly specific, strange placement was absolutely not random. It was deeply rooted in complex, widely accepted medieval medical lore. The learned doctors held a popular, stubborn belief that the fourth finger contained a very special, magical blood vessel. They passionately called it the vena amoris, or the beautiful vein of love. They truly believed this single, tiny vein connected directly from the tip of the finger straight to the beating human heart. By permanently binding this specific finger with a solid ring of iron or bright gold, they believed they were physically binding the woman's beating heart directly to her new husband forever. Only after the solemn vows are spoken, the worldly property endowed, and the precious rings securely exchanged, does the ceremony finally move indoors. The heavy oak doors are suddenly thrown wide open. The happy couple, now legally and spiritually bound forever, finally enters the dim church together. They walk slowly toward the glowing high altar to attend a very special, holy nuptial mass. They kneel humbly on the hard stone and receive the sacred Holy Communion. The immense spiritual weight of the universal church officially seals their humble earthly contract. But the quiet religious solemnity soon gives way to raucous, loud, and earthy celebration. The massive wedding feast is a joyous, mandatory communal obligation. It is a rare, treasured moment of pure abundance in a hard life normally defined by brutal scarcity. Often, the expensive feast was cleverly funded by the poor couple themselves. They would spend many exhausting weeks brewing huge, bubbling vats of incredibly strong, dark ale, widely known as bride ale. They would then happily sell this potent, intoxicating drink to their thirsty, dancing neighbors to quickly raise essential money for their new household. Breathe in the rich, delicious, yeasty scent of freshly baked bread and the sharp, sour temps of the strong bride ale. The happy village greedily devours salted roasted meats and dances wildly to the lively, trilling tunes of a carved wooden flute. As the long day slowly turns to a dark, starry night, the final, and perhaps most truly bizarre, ritual takes place. It is time for the highly anticipated bedding ceremony. The rowdy village absolutely does not politely leave the exhausted couple to their quiet privacy. Instead, the entire drunken community excitedly escorts the blushing newlyweds directly to their private bedchamber. Here, the rowdy, echoing, and joyous laughter of stumbling villagers carrying bright, flickering torches to the couple's humble, thatched cottage. The nervous couple climbs awkwardly into the straw bed, often fully clothed or dressed in their simple sleeping garments. The local priest enters the crowded, noisy chamber. He gently sprinkles the humble straw bed with cool, holy water. He recites long Latin prayers to specifically bless the chamber, strongly ward off lingering evil spirits, and desperately ensure future fertility. The noisy villagers stand closely around the bed, drinking heavily, cheering loudly, and offering incredibly bawdy, inappropriate advice. They are there specifically to witness the official beginning of the physical consummation. They must visually verify that the couple is indeed sharing a bed, fulfilling the absolute final, necessary requirement of the strict marriage contract. Finally, mercifully, the heavy woolen curtains are drawn, the wooden door is pulled shut, and the exhausted villagers stumble happily back to their own dark homes. As we leave the sleeping villagers to their quiet celebrations, and the dark night grows just a little quieter, I would love to know what other hidden corners of history you would like to explore with me. What quiet, forgotten mysteries or strange everyday lives should we dive into next? Let me know in the comments below, and we might just wander there together in a future peaceful story. Now, let us step deeper inside the medieval home, where the complex rules of daily life were about to become wonderfully, deeply complex. The rules were not just about how couples behaved. They strictly dictated exactly when they were allowed to be together. To understand this overwhelming control, we must look at the rule books. These were known as the penitentials. They were incredibly detailed, heavy handbooks used by local priests. The priests used them to formally assign penance for specific daily sins. These vast books contained highly specific, sometimes truly bizarre catalogs. They listed exactly what married couples could and could not do in the absolute privacy of their own small homes. The fascinating history of these strange manuals begins far away from our quiet village. They were created initially by strict Irish monks in the distant 6th century. These monks lived in isolated, freezing stone monasteries on the edge of the wild ocean. They sought to perfectly standardize penance for various human transgressions. They wanted a uniform system of spiritual punishment. Over the centuries, these local monastic guidelines spread across the entire continent. They were slowly organized like massive, complex legal catalogs. They perfectly matched specific, detailed scenes with exact, punishing days of fasting on dry bread and cold water. In the early 11th century, a powerful bishop named Burchard of Worms took this to a new extreme. He wrote a massive, influential collection of laws known as the Decretum. This heavy text included a massive, exhaustive section entirely detailing domestic and intimate sins. Imagine the thick, heavy binding of a leather penitential manual resting quietly on a carved wooden lectern. Picture the soft, rhythmic turning of stiff, pale vellum pages in a quiet, echoing stone room. Every single turn of the page revealed another strict limitation on human love. These rigid manuals legally required local priests to actively interrogate their simple parishioners. This happened during the quiet, tense moments of weekly confession. The priest had to ask deeply uncomfortable questions about the specific, private logistics of their marital lives. Listen to the hushed, secretive whispers echoing in the tight, dark space of the wooden confessional. The frightened peasant would kneel on the hard stone. They would desperately try to answer the probing, confusing questions. The fundamental rule was completely uncompromising. Any physical intimacy strictly had to be for the sole purpose of procreation. Seeking any personal pleasure within the bounds of legal marriage was officially considered a venial sin. It was a spiritual stain that required immediate cleansing. The strict missionary position was aggressively, legally enforced. It was deemed the only natural and legally permissible arrangement for married couples. Any deviation from this single, approved act was viewed with deep theological horror. In fact, the thick penitentials assigned incredibly harsh, shocking penalties for minor physical deviations. These deeply private, harmless acts were often punished far more severely than certain types of public theft or violent property damage. Stealing a neighbor's heavy iron plow might earn a lighter penance than simply enjoying the company of one's own spouse on a Tuesday. However, the church recognized a terrible danger in these detailed interrogations. Young, inexperienced priests were strictly instructed to use extreme discretion when asking these probing questions. The bishops deeply feared that a foolish priest might accidentally teach a completely innocent, ignorant peasant a brand new sin they had never even thought of before. These massive, terrifying manuals were entirely written in complex, scholarly Latin. This meant the educated local priest was the sole, undisputed interpreter of these complex rules for the entire illiterate village. The peasants simply had to blindly trust his stern translations. When a rule was broken, the resulting penance was brutal and exhausting. It usually involved prolonged periods of strict fasting. Taste the dry, coarse barley bread and the bitter cold water consumed during a long penance. It might involve mindlessly reciting hundreds of long psalms in the dark. Or it could require standing completely barefoot outside the heavy church doors during the freezing, bitter winter. Feel the chilling, agonizing bite of the frozen stone floor against bare, aching feet during a long winter vigil. But the most exhausting aspect of medieval marriage was not the method, but the timing. We must take a very deep dive into the medieval liturgical calendar. It was heavily populated with countless feast days, strict fast days, and long periods of mandatory spiritual purification. This created an astonishing, almost unbelievable number of days where marital intimacy was strictly forbidden by supreme law. Let us slowly count the forbidden days. Intimacy was strictly, entirely forbidden during the entire 40-day period of Lent. This was the long, somber season leading up to the holy celebration of Easter. Picture the methodical, tired scratching of charcoal crossing out long, hungry days on a rough wooden board. See the somber, dark purple cloth draped heavily over the quiet church altar during the long, endless weeks of Lent. Those 40 days were a time of absolute physical denial. Then came the bitter winter. Intimacy was also completely banned during the 40 days of Advent. This was the dark, freezing season of spiritual preparation leading directly up to Christmas. Another 40 days of total, forced separation in the freezing, dark nights. The strict prohibition also extended to the 8 joyful days immediately following Easter. This period was officially known as the Easter Octave. The days surrounding the Holy Feast of Pentecost were also completely off-limits. But the calendar of constraint did not stop with the major seasons. The couples were legally required to abstain on all the specific feast days of major, recognized saints. In a deeply pious medieval diocese, these important holy days could easily number well over 40 days a year. Listen to the relentless, rhythmic, heavy tolling of the brass bell announcing yet another saint's feast day. Every single ring of the bell was another stern reminder of what was legally forbidden that night. Even ordinary, quiet weeks offered very little respite from the endless rules. Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday of every single week were strictly, permanently off limits. Wednesday was the day Judas supposedly betrayed Christ. Friday was the dark day of the crucifixion, associated with strict fasting and bodily denial. Saturday was deeply dedicated to the pure Virgin Mary. Feel the cold, damp, gray light of a rainy Wednesday morning, where strict, hungry fasting began anew. And then there was Sunday. Sunday was the Lord's Day. It was a day of pure rest and absolute spiritual focus. It was completely, entirely forbidden to share a bed with your spouse on this holy day. The medieval mind held terrifying superstitions about breaking this specific rule. Popular medical lore clearly stated that any violations on a Sunday would tragically result in children born with terrible physical ailments or crippling diseases. Beyond the strict church calendar, there were deeply personal biological restrictions. Intimacy was totally banned during a woman's natural menstrual cycle. It was completely forbidden during the entire 9 months of a delicate pregnancy. And it was strictly banned for 40 long days after childbirth, for a required period of ritual purification. Hear the quiet, heavy sigh of a tired, confused peasant, trying to remember which phase of the pale moon perfectly aligned with the complex church calendar. In total, the sheer math of medieval love is absolutely staggering. If a strict, deeply pious medieval couple actually followed every single rule perfectly, they were forbidden from intimacy for roughly 250 to 270 days of the year. The calendar was an exhausting, monotonous labyrinth of denial. And these were not mere suggestions. They were legally binding laws. A frustrated husband or an angry wife could easily, legally report their own spouse to the local parish priest if they aggressively attempted to break the strict calendar rules. Despite this massive, overwhelming list of forbidden days, the medieval couple faced a fascinating theological contradiction. On the very few, rare days that were actually allowed, they were bound by a completely different theological rule. This bizarre rule legally required them to be intimate. This complex, confusing concept was known widely as the marital debt. The theology of the marital debt, or the debitum conjugal, was deeply rooted in ancient texts. It was based primarily on the biblical writings of the Apostle Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians. This ancient text dictated a radical, surprising concept for the medieval era. It clearly stated that upon the legal vows of marriage, neither spouse retained exclusive, absolute ownership of their own physical body. Their body now literally, legally, belonged completely to their wedded partner. Therefore, if one spouse officially requested intimacy on a legally permitted day, the other spouse was theologically and legally bound to comply. They could not simply say no because they were tired from the fields. This was one of the very few remarkable areas in all of medieval law where men and women actually possessed complete, absolute theoretical equality. A peasant wife had the exact same, undeniable, legal right to demand the formal debt from her husband as he did from her. Refusing to safely pay the marital debt when properly asked was considered a very grave, dangerous sin. The Church logically reasoned that refusing a spouse's legal request directly tempted the denied spouse to stray. It pushed them toward the terrible, destructive sin of adultery outside the home. Therefore, you were legally obligated to protect your spouse's eternal soul by offering your own body on demand. However, this created a terrifying, impossible tightrope for the anxious couple to walk. While you had to pay the debt, Requesting the debt too frequently was dangerous. Requesting it with far too much passion or worldly enthusiasm was officially considered the mortal sin of lust. You had to perform the act out of strict legal duty, not out of wild, joyful desire. Imagine the heavy, leather-bound writings of St. Paul illuminated with bright gold leaf in a silent monastery library. These beautiful, quiet books contained the heavy chains of marital obligation. Couples could attempt to escape this exhausting cycle. They could bravely take a solemn vow of total chastity within their legal marriage. This was known as a chaste marriage. But they could only legally do so if both parties mutually, freely agreed. One spouse could never force chastity upon the other, as it would deny them their legal debt. This strict rule of the debt affected grand historical events, as well as simple peasant lives. If a wealthy husband or a brave knight wanted to go on a long, dangerous crusade to the Holy Land, he faced a legal hurdle. Or if he merely wished to embark on a long, pious pilgrimage to a distant shrine, he had to ask his wife. He absolutely had to get his wife's explicit, written or verbal permission first. His long, uncertain absence would unjustly deny her the legal marital debt for years. Hear the sharp, rhythmic scratching of a sharpened quill as an exhausted bishop finally signs a legal dispensation for a worried knight departing for Jerusalem. Great, brilliant theologians, like the famous Thomas Aquinas, wrote extensively, endlessly, on the complex marital debt. He spent years categorizing exactly when it was a terrible sin to ask, but absolutely not a sin to politely pay. Picture the monotonous, droning, endless voice of a dry theologian debating the exact, microscopic legal definition of physical consent in a dusty university hall. They debated these intimate, private matters with the exact same cold, calculating logic they used to debate the Holy Trinity or the nature of angels. Managing the confusing calendar of forbidden days was deeply stressful. Fulfilling the strict legal obligations of the marital debt was physically and spiritually exhausting. But all of this was made infinitely more complicated by the stark physical reality of where these people actually slept. We must return our quiet focus to the cramped, dark reality of the medieval home. Only the absolute highest, wealthiest nobility ever enjoyed the rare, incredible luxury of a truly private bedchamber. The vast, overwhelming majority of human society lived in massive communal halls or tiny, single-room houses. In the humble peasant cottages of our quiet village, the lack of privacy was absolute and complete. Children slept in the exact same small room as their tired parents. Very often, to conserve essential body heat in the freezing winters, they slept in the exact same cramped straw bed until they were quite older. Bed sharing was not a sign of poverty, but a completely universal, unquestioned cultural norm. Weary travelers staying at strange, roadside inns routinely shared small beds with complete, unknown strangers simply to save a precious copper coin. Young, hard-working apprentices and lowly household servants typically slept lightly on thin, dry straw pallets right at the very foot of their strict master's bed. Or they simply curled up tightly on the cold, dusty workshop floor among the tools. Furthermore, absolute, comforting darkness was incredibly rare in the medieval home. The central, smoky hearth fire was the absolute lifeblood of the family. It had to be carefully, meticulously kept banked with thick gray ash every single night, but it had to remain dimly glowing all night long to prevent the fragile house from freezing completely solid. Look at the dull, deep red glow of hot embers breathing slowly beneath a thick layer of gray ash in the stone hearth. This weak, red light cast long, shifting shadows across the small, crowded room. Because of these incredibly close, tightly packed quarters, the watchful church issued yet another strict mandate. They heavily mandated that any legal intimacy must be conducted with absolute, total silence. It had to be done with the utmost discretion so as not to accidentally awaken or spiritually corrupt the innocent, sleeping children nearby. Listen to the gentle, rhythmic, slow breathing of a large family sleeping, huddled closely together for warmth under heavy wool. Any sudden movement or loud noise would instantly wake the entire crowded household. For the slightly wealthier, emerging middle class in the growing towns, there was one small comfort: heavy, thick curtains drawn tightly around a sturdy wooden bed were the absolute only form of real privacy available. Here the heavy, rough, woolen texture of a thick bed curtain being quietly, carefully pulled shut on rattling wooden rings. It was a tiny, fragile fortress of fabric against the watchful eyes of the crowded world. But even with curtains, the intense community surveillance was absolute. Nosy neighbors lived so incredibly closely that muffled sounds quickly traveled through the very thin wattle and daub walls. Here the distinct, muffled, annoying sound of a restless neighbor's dog barking sharply right through the thin mud plaster wall. Every argument, every quiet conversation, and every intimate moment was constantly at risk of being completely overheard by the entire village. If a foolish couple was caught breaking the strict social norms, the village did not simply whisper. They enacted a terrifying, public shaming ritual widely known as the shivaree, also known as rough music. This was a brutal, loud punishment. The angry villagers would gather outside the home of the offending couple in the dead of night. They would violently bang heavy iron pots, clash wooden spoons, and scream loudly to publicly shame the frightened couple into total submission. Because of this intense lack of privacy, the constant fear of the church, and the crushing exhaustion of daily labor, historians draw a logical conclusion. They note that typical medieval intimacy was likely incredibly brief, completely silent, heavily clothed, and completely shrouded in the heavy stillness of the dark. Feel the absolute, heavy, suffocating stillness of a dark, cramped room where every single slight rustle of dry straw is loudly amplified. It was a quiet, hidden act stolen in the dark, constantly weighed down by the massive, invisible burden of 1,000 strict, bizarre rules. It is almost hard to imagine trying to keep perfect track of such an exhausting, endless calendar of rules, while simply just trying to survive the brutal winter. Have you ever come across a strange historical rule or an old-fashioned law that just completely, utterly baffled you? Share it in the comments below. I always truly love reading the strange, fascinating historical facts you bring to our little channel. Let us move much deeper into the quiet night now, and look at what exactly happened when these truly bizarre rules were actually enforced by the courts. When the strict rules of the medieval village were inevitably broken, the frightened peasants did not go to the local lord. They were summoned directly to the ecclesiastical courts of the powerful church. These highly specific legal gatherings handled absolutely all moral crimes and spiritual infractions across the land. They dealt with the complex sins of the flesh and the quiet failures of the home. Because of the deeply intimate and often embarrassing nature of the cases they heard, they earned a scandalous nickname: The common English populace informally and quietly called them the Bodie Courts. It was a whispered title that perfectly captured the highly personal nature of the trials held within those cold stone walls. These courts were fundamentally different from the secular courts of the kings and lords. The Bodie Courts did not usually hand down brutal physical punishments like flogging or the stocks. Their true, terrifying power lay in the invisible realm of the spirit and the heavy weight of the community. They held the ultimate power of formal excommunication. They could entirely sever a soul from the saving grace of God, but more commonly, they relied on the crushing, humiliating weight of required public penance to enforce their strict rules. Because the village lived in such incredibly close, cramped quarters, secret scenes rarely stayed secret for very long. Neighbors frequently and eagerly testified against one another before the stern judges. The people who shared your daily labor and borrowed your tools served as the primary, sworn witnesses for any moral infractions in the village. They listened closely through the thin mud walls of the cottages. They watched the dark alleys and reported everything they saw to the watchful parish priest. Because reputation was everything in a small village, defamation was one of the most common and serious charges brought before these courts. Words held immense, dangerous power. Publicly calling someone a violator of the sacred marriage laws could completely ruin their fragile economic standing. If a hard-working man was falsely accused of breaking his vows, his angry neighbors might refuse to trade with him or help him harvest his vital crops. A careless, whispered rumor could quickly lead to literal starvation for an entire family. A broken promise of marriage was not just a sad, personal tragedy. A broken betrothal was a very serious, highly complex legal matter of a breached contract. The court demanded hard, physical evidence of the failed promises. The jilted party often required the formal presentation of the small tokens exchanged during the courtship as undeniable evidence. A simple, dusty ribbon, a carved wooden spoon, or a bent silver coin was held high before the judge. It proved that a legally binding promise had been spoken and then cruelly abandoned. To bring the accused villagers to face justice, the courts employed relentless, traveling officials. These feared men were known officially as apporters. They constantly roamed the muddy countryside and the isolated, quiet villages. They carried heavy parchment scrolls bearing the official seals of the local bishop. They arrived unannounced, loudly summoning the terrified accused villagers to immediately appear before the bishop's stern judges in the distant cathedral town. The daily operations of these courts were meticulously, obsessively documented by tired clerks. The records of these courts were kept in detailed, heavy Latin registers. These massive, bound books were filled with endless, cramped handwriting. They carefully recorded every single spoken dispute, every tearful denial, and every final judgment. Today, these dusty, forgotten books provide historians with the absolute best, most detailed evidence of actual daily peasant life. When a villager was finally found guilty of a moral crime, the required penance was designed to be deeply, unforgettably humiliating. The punishments often involved the guilty party walking slowly around the local parish church on a busy Sunday. They had to walk this path 3 full times, while the entire congregation watched in judgmental silence. They were forced to walk completely barefoot on the cold, hard earth. They had to carry a heavy, lit white candle in their trembling hands as a bright symbol of their public shame and their promised purification. Occasionally, heavy monetary fines were issued to the guilty parties. But the primary, overriding goal of the ecclesiastical court was not the generation of revenue for the bishop. The true goal was the absolute restoration of vital community peace and the strict maintenance of moral order. They needed the village to function smoothly so the vital agricultural work could continue without violent interruption. Therefore, despite the terrifying strictness of the written laws, the actual courts were often surprisingly pragmatic in their rulings. The weary judges knew that a broken home led to a broken, starving farm. They often spent hours aggressively pushing angry couples to simply forgive each other and reconcile. They vastly preferred forcing a troubled couple to return to their shared hearth rather than issuing severe, permanent punishments that would destroy a working family unit. Listen to the slow, echoing footsteps of an exhausted judge walking across the cold stone floor of a grand cathedral nave. He is deeply tired of the endless, petty squabbles of the village. While most cases were merely about preserving troubled marriages or punishing idle gossip, the courts sometimes faced a much greater challenge. Occasionally, the courts were forced to legally dismantle a marriage entirely. This drastic action required truly bizarre, exhausting levels of bureaucratic proof. We must explore the curious, incredibly complex cases of medieval annulment. To understand this process, we must first understand a fundamental rule of the era. True, modern divorce simply did not exist in medieval canon law. You could not simply decide you were unhappy and legally end the union. A legally valid marriage was officially considered a permanent, unbreakable, and holy sacrament. Once the final vows were spoken at the church door, the two souls were bound together until death finally separated them. Because divorce was impossible, the only legal escape was an official annulment. An annulment was not a cancellation of a valid marriage. It was a formal, complex legal declaration that the marriage had actually never existed in the first place. The court had to miraculously prove that a hidden, pre-existing impediment had secretly invalidated the sacred vows from the very beginning. It was a massive, exhausting legal fiction. The most common, acceptable grounds for a requested annulment were strictly bureaucratic. The first was the sudden, shocking discovery of hidden consanguinity. This meant proving to the court that you and your spouse were actually closely related by blood, completely violating the strict kinship laws. The second common ground was proving a pre-contract. This involved producing sudden witnesses to swear that one party was actually already secretly married to someone else in a distant, forgotten town. But there was another, far more private and deeply uncomfortable, valid ground for a legal annulment. The absolute inability to physically consummate the marriage was a highly serious legal matter. This physical failure, known broadly as impotence, legally and entirely invalidated the original marriage contract. The Church believed that if the marital debt could not be paid, the entire legal contract was completely null and void. However, simply claiming impotence before the judge was absolutely not taken lightly by the skeptical court. The Church desperately wanted to preserve every single marriage at all costs. Therefore, the strict court required a mandatory, agonizing 3-year waiting period. The unhappy couple was legally forced to remain completely together in their small home for 3 full years. This long delay was designed to absolutely ensure the delicate physical issue was not merely a temporary affliction or a passing curse. Feel the heavy, solemn and quiet tick of time slowly passing during this long, miserable waiting period. If the bitter claim of impotence persisted after 3 long years, the court took drastic, highly intrusive measures. They would formally deploy a special jury of honest women to investigate the private matter. These women were usually older, highly respected local midwives from the surrounding villages. They were ordered to physically carefully examine the couple and report their deeply private findings directly to the waiting judge. Picture the quiet, stern faces of the elderly midwives whispering softly together in a dark, paneled antechamber. In some specific, strict regions, the court would mandate a truly bizarre and humiliating trial by physical proof. This was the ultimate invasion of personal privacy. The desperate couple was actually monitored in a designated bedchamber by selected church officials and the jury of midwives. They were legally ordered to attempt consummation while the appointed witnesses waited quietly just outside the drawn bed curtains or right inside the room. The sheer volume of paperwork and bureaucracy surrounding these strange trials was truly immense and exhausting. The busy court required countless sworn written depositions from absolutely everyone involved. Nosy neighbors, distant family members, and local medical experts were all called to testify under a holy oath. They were aggressively questioned about the couple's private habits, their daily arguments, and their physical health. The slow melting of red wax seals on official ecclesiastical decrees marked the endless, slow progression of the complex case. If the difficult annulment was finally, officially granted due to proven impotence, the legal results were highly specific. The capable, healthy party was legally allowed to walk away and remarry someone else entirely. But the party proven to be impotent was strictly, permanently forbidden from ever attempting to marry again. They were legally barred from the sacrament for the rest of their natural life. Here, the absolute, heavy, echoing finality of a wooden gavel striking the bench, severing a human bond forever. These highly intrusive, bizarre trials clearly highlight a profound truth about this era. They demonstrate the Church's total, unyielding commitment to regulating the absolute physical realities of its humble subjects. The Church did not just care about the abstract soul, it cared deeply about the physical mechanics of the human body. To inform these complex legal decisions, the courts relied heavily on the accepted medical science of the day. This science viewed human emotions, deep romance, and physical intimacy through a deeply strange physiological lens. Medieval medicine was completely, fundamentally different from our modern understanding of the human body. It was based entirely on the ancient, classical Greek system known as the four humors. The learned doctors firmly believed the human body was filled with 4 distinct, powerful, internal liquids. These were hot blood, dry yellow bile, cold black bile, and wet phlegm. Every single aspect of human health was dictated by these 4 mysterious fluids. According to this ancient science, perfect, radiant health required absolute balance. Both physical vitality and emotional stability required the exact, perfect balancing of these 4 internal liquids. If you had too much blood, you became overly passionate and dangerously hot. If you had too much phlegm, you became incredibly sluggish, dull, and cold. The goal of every medieval physician was to constantly monitor and aggressively correct this fragile, shifting, internal balance. In this strange medical system, deep romantic love was not just a fleeting feeling in the heart. True love sickness was considered a very real, highly dangerous, and potentially fatal medical condition. It was clinically known by the Latin term amor herios. The learned doctors believed this terrible affliction was caused directly by a massive, sudden excess of cold, dry black bile in the body. This excess led directly to a state of profound, dangerous melancholy. The documented medical symptoms of this literal love sickness were taken incredibly seriously by the worried doctors. A patient suffering from a broken heart would exhibit deep, dark, sunken eyes and suffer from chronic, exhausting insomnia. They would experience a total, sudden loss of appetite, refusing even the sweetest foods. Most dangerously, the doctors would detect a slow, irregular, and fading pulse. The deep emotional sorrow was literally, physically draining the vital life force directly from their frail bodies. To cure this dangerous melancholy, the doctors consulted heavy, ancient texts. They relied heavily on the translated wisdom of the brilliant Islamic scholar Avicenna. His famous medical texts recommended highly specific, gentle treatments for the suffering, lovesick patient. They recommended treating the excess black bile with long, warm, and soothing cool baths to restore the body's lost moisture. Here, the slow, rhythmic, and peaceful dripping of a cool, restorative water bath in a quiet room. They prescribed reading light, joyful poetry, and playing distracting sweet music to gently lift the heavy, depressed spirits. Listen to the gentle, slow plucking sound of a wooden lute played specifically to soothe a deeply melancholic patient. The physical act of marital intimacy was also viewed strictly through this complex humoral lens. It was not just an emotional act, but a powerful medical event. The doctors believed the act actively, dangerously heated the entire physical body. It dramatically altered the delicate balance of the four humors. Therefore, it required careful, constant regulation and specific medical advice to prevent dangerous internal fevers or sudden exhaustion. The learned doctors advised that specific, everyday foods could directly influence a couple's quiet marital life. They believed that heavily spiced, roasted meats and dark, strong wine were naturally hot and dry. Therefore, these expensive foods were thought to greatly increase the internal heat and naturally stimulate physical desire. Breathe in the sharp, pungent aroma of dried, imported herbs and freshly ground spices resting in an apothecary's carved wooden bowl. Conversely, the doctors recommended a completely different diet for those sworn to holy celibacy. Cold, watery, and cooling foods like crisp lettuce, fresh cucumbers, and pale river fish were highly recommended. These bland foods were specifically regularly served to the quiet monks and the cloistered nuns. The doctors firmly believed these foods would literally cool the hot blood and successfully suppress any lingering, unwanted physical desires. Imagine the crisp, watery, and loud crunch of fresh, green lettuce, prescribed specifically to calm the restless mind. This complex medical theory also dictated the strict rules of human conception. The doctors believed that successful conception was a matter of perfect humoral symmetry. It was believed to legally require both the male and the female body to be at the exact, perfect, same temperature. They had to achieve a perfect, matched humoral balance at the exact moment of intimacy. If the husband was too hot with yellow bile, or the wife too cold with phlegm, the union would fail entirely. Because of this widely accepted science, these heavy medical texts were often directly consulted by the ecclesiastical church when the strict courts had to determine if a couple's sad failure to conceive was a simple medical imbalance or a terrifying divine punishment. they turned to the doctors. The heavy rustle of an oversized, leather-bound medical text written in dense, cramped Latin could easily decide the legal fate of a desperate peasant marriage. Yet, despite the terrifying legal threats of the body courts and the cold, clinical advice of the humoral doctors, there is another vital part of this story. Beneath all the heavy parchment bureaucracy and the endless calendars of constraint, genuine, quiet human affection still found a beautiful way to truly thrive. We must look past the strict laws to find the real people living in the shadows. Even within the rigid framework of the church, true love was not entirely ignored. Despite the church's intense, relentless focus on pure procreation and strict marital duty, mutual affection was widely recognized as essential. The priests and the doctors both agreed that genuine affection was absolutely required for a stable, peaceful, and productive household. A home filled with constant, bitter hatred was a home that would eventually fail to survive the harsh winters. We know this quiet love existed because we can still find its physical traces today. Modern archaeological digs in ancient peasant villages frequently turn up beautiful, touching evidence of true romance. Deep in the muddy earth, they find small, inexpensive, but deeply meaningful tokens of pure affection. They uncover simple, cheap pewter rings exchanged in secret. Feel the smooth, deeply worn surface of a cheap pewter ring, polished constantly by years of daily, loving wear. They find intricately carved wooden brooches, whittled slowly by the firelight as a quiet gift for a beloved wife. Even the dry, strict court records occasionally reveal the deep, beating heart of the medieval village. While these Latin registers mostly highlight bitter disputes and angry gossip, they also inadvertently record moments of profound, shattering grief. A witness might casually mention the deep, inconsolable sorrow of a neighbor when their beloved spouse suddenly passed away from a winter fever. These brief, translated sentences remind us of the deep love that existed behind the closed wooden doors. The historical concept of the companionate marriage was not just a modern invention. A partnership based heavily on deep mutual respect, shared laughter, and equally shared labor was the actual, practical reality for most hard-working peasants. They were not just fulfilling a cold, legal debt. They were essential, equal partners in the desperate, daily struggle to simply stay alive in a very harsh world. Working quietly side by side in the muddy fields forged these bonds. Sharing the massive, back-breaking burden of the autumn harvest created deep, completely unbreakable bonds between the rural couples. Picture the quiet, perfectly synchronized, and slow rhythm of two people harvesting golden wheat side by side in a sunlit field. Every swing of the sharp scythe was a shared effort to feed their children. This deep, shared physical labor created a profound intimacy that no distant bishop could ever truly understand or successfully regulate. The tragic coroner's rolls from the era also tell incredible stories of ultimate, absolute devotion. These sad, meticulous legal death records occasionally detail amazing stories of sheer bravery. They record ordinary husbands and wives dying tragically while desperately trying to save each other from sudden house fires or terrible agricultural accidents. They willingly gave their own lives to protect the person they had promised to love at the church door so many years ago. Among the slightly wealthier, literate merchant class, we find even more direct proof of this enduring romance. Surviving personal letters written between traveling merchants and their waiting wives are incredibly touching. They frequently reveal deeply affectionate, silly nicknames. They express profound, aching longing during long, lonely absences at distant trade fairs. These fragile, fading letters prove that the human heart has always spoken the exact same language of love and missing someone dearly. Historians now believe that the incredibly strict, impossible rules of the heavy penitentials were mostly seen as a theoretical ideal. They were a perfect, impossible standard created by lonely monks. But the actual, lived reality in the comforting dark of the small peasant cottage was far more practical, far more forgiving, and far more deeply human. The shared, brutal hardship of surviving freezing, dark winters, and terrified meager harvests created a beautiful intimacy. It was a profound closeness that no distant church council could ever successfully regulate or destroy. Feel the gentle, shared, and vital warmth of two rough hands clasping tightly together over a slowly dying, red hearth fire. In the end, the simple need for human comfort completely overpowered the massive weight of the complex law. In the quiet, deeply peaceful hours of the dark night, away from the watchful priest's gaze and the nosy neighbors, they were finally free. The medieval couples were ultimately just tired human beings desperate to find simple comfort and quiet peace in one another. Hear the soft, muffled, and happy whisper of a private joke shared safely in the pitch black of the night. Listen to the deep, heavy, and long sigh of absolute contentment as a weary couple finally falls asleep together under a heavy, warm wool blanket. And so, as the embers in the village hearths finally burn down to a soft, glowing ash, we leave the medieval peasants to their rest. Their lives, though governed by bizarre calendars and exhausting theological rules, were ultimately anchored by the same quiet desire for companionship that we feel today. Beneath the weight of parchment laws and towering stone churches, they found warmth in the shadows. I hope this journey through the complicated labyrinth of medieval romance has helped quiet your mind tonight. We are going to gently transition now into a softer, more reflective space, exploring how these strange rules slowly faded into history. If you are already drifting off, let my voice simply be a comforting presence in the background, and I wish you the sweetest of dreams. The story of love began to change. It shifted softly in the 12th century. The high nobility of southern France started a quiet rebellion. Deep in the sunlit lands of Aquitaine, a new idea bloomed softly. The air there was warmer, and the culture was richer. They called this beautiful new concept fin amour. Today we know it simply as courtly love. It was a refined and highly stylized way of viewing human affection. This was a direct cultural revolt against the strict rule of the church. The clergy viewed marriage in a very different and cold light. To the priests, marriage was a sterile and bureaucratic duty. It was merely a functional tool for basic economics and simple procreation. The church had stripped all the gentle joy from the union of souls. But the nobles longed for something far more profound. How could the human heart survive on endless duty alone? Noble marriages were strictly political alliances. They were forged in cold stone halls to secure vast tracts of land. They were designed to end bloody wars and unite powerful feuding families. Because of this, true passion was believed to exist only outside of marriage. The marital bed was a place of business and lineage. Love had to be a sweet secret hidden away from the world. It had to be entirely separate from the heavy burdens of statecraft. It was divorced from the daily management of inherited lands and peasant taxes. The delicate, winding script of a romantic poem appeared. It was penned carefully on pristine white vellum. The dark ink dried slowly in the flickering candlelight. This was the fresh new language of the awakening heart. The classic model of courtly love was highly specific and deeply tragic. It involved a young and often unlanded knight. He would devote himself entirely to an unattainable and married noblewoman. She was usually the wealthy wife of his own powerful lord. The soft, echoing rustle of heavy silk gowns could be heard. The lady swept gracefully across a sunlit stone castle courtyard. She was a brilliant vision of perfection, meant to be admired from afar. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a primary and vital patron of this movement. She was one of the most powerful and fascinating women in history. She brought these romantic ideals from the warm South to the colder courts of France and England. Her influence reshaped the very nature of aristocratic society. The distant, lonely call of a hunting horn echoed. It drifted sadly through a misty and ancient forest. Knights rode out into the world with the sacred image of their lady in mind. The relationship between knight and lady was highly ritualized. It purposely and carefully mimicked the strict rules of the feudal system. The knight swore absolute fealty to his lady, just as he would to a powerful king. He was her humble servant in all matters of the heart. The vibrant, deep reds and golds of a woven tapestry told the story. The fine, silken threads depicted a brave knight kneeling in humble adoration before his lady. Andreas Capellanus captured this intense spirit in the late 1100s. He wrote a famous text called The Art of Courtly Love. It served as a satirical yet highly influential rulebook for noble romance. It was read in quiet corners and discussed in grand gardens. One of his primary rules was delightfully and dangerously subversive. He explicitly stated that marriage is no real excuse for not loving. This bold statement cemented the movement's rebellious nature. It gave silent permission for longing hearts to wander beyond the arranged marriage bed. Courtly love emphasized deep longing and beautiful suffering. Immediate physical gratification was rarely the actual goal of these romantic pursuits. The denial of the flesh made the love feel more spiritual and pure. Instead, the slow, methodical polishing of steel armor took place in quiet preparation. A knight prepared for a brutal tournament to perform noble deeds in his lady's honor. The silent suffering of unrequited love was seen as a purifying fire. This vast literary movement forever changed Western culture. It introduced the profound concept of romantic love to the world. Love was now seen as an ennobling and overwhelming force. It was a power that could conquer even the darkest of days. This new philosophy of love was not just kept safely in heavy books. It was broadcast loudly across the entirety of Europe. The sweeping music and poetry of traveling performers carried the message far and wide. And so the beautiful song of romance spread. The troubadours became the dedicated messengers of a bright new era. They were brilliant lyric poets and highly skilled musicians. They flourished beautifully in the Occitan-speaking regions of southern France during the High Middle Ages. These men were not merely lowly traveling minstrels begging for stray coins. Many troubadours were actually wealthy nobles and highly respected knights. Some were even incredibly powerful kings of vast realms. Richard the Lionheart himself composed these sweet romantic songs while away on campaign. Their beautiful songs were known as canzos. They primarily focused on grand themes of chivalry and honor. They sang endlessly of the agonizing beauty of unrequited love. The intricate melodic plucking of a wooden lute filled the warm air. It resonated deeply in a quiet and firelit grand hall. The music was utterly intoxicating and entirely new to medieval ears. Female troubadours existed and thrived as well. They were known respectfully as troborites. These talented women wrote complex songs that offered a rare and authentic female perspective on medieval romance. They sang boldly of their own deep desires and quiet sorrows. The soft, lingering echo of a solitary voice drifted through the cool night. It was sung in a beautiful and now forgotten dialect. The music of the troubadours was highly complex and mathematically precise. It used sophisticated and interlocking rhyme schemes. It featured intricate melodies that twisted and turned like a river. This stood in stark and beautiful contrast to the monotonous plainchant of traditional church music. It was secular music that made the human heart beat faster. Troubadour poetry popularized the romantic concept of the alba. This was a very specific and sorrowful type of mourning song. The alba depicted the profound sorrow of secret lovers who were forced to part at sunrise. The slow gray light of dawn crept inevitably over the horizon. The weary lovers wept softly as the new day began. The gentle flutter of a bright silk ribbon fell through the cool morning air. It was dropped sadly from a high castle window to a waiting knight below. The artistic movement eventually spread north into the lands of Germany. It deeply inspired the musicians known as the Minnesingers. They beautifully adapted the grand themes of love into their own unique cultural traditions. These traveling musicians essentially served as the pop culture influencers of their day. They traveled endlessly from royal court to royal court. The dusty, well-worn leather boots of a weary traveler walked a long dirt road between kingdoms. They carried the sweet, infectious disease of romance with them. They normalized deep emotional expression across the entire continent. The church heavily and angrily criticized the troubadours, of course. They viewed these popular secular songs of passion as a highly dangerous distraction. Love was pulling weak minds away from strict spiritual devotion. The stern clerics preached endlessly against the seductive songs. They warned of the fires of hell for those who listened. But the beautiful music simply could not be stopped. Despite the fierce and ongoing resistance of the church, the ideals took deep root. The troubadours' heavy emphasis on romance eventually filtered slowly downward. It moved gently from the highest nobility down to the merchant and peasant classes. As these romantic ideals slowly permeated society, the later Middle Ages saw a gradual shift. Laws and culture began to subtly change how they approached the daily realities of marriage. But this was only the quiet beginning of a much larger transformation. The societal changes of the later Middle Ages were immense and unstoppable. The catastrophic demographic collapse of the Black Death struck fiercely in the mid-14th century. It fundamentally and permanently altered the social fabric of all of Europe. The medieval world was forever changed by the immense and tragic loss of human life. With a massive and sudden labor shortage sweeping the land, things began to shift. Surviving peasants suddenly found themselves with vastly increased bargaining power. Wealthy lords needed strong workers more than ever before just to survive. This slowly and naturally led to slightly better living conditions for the poor. The humble peasant homes began to gradually grow, slightly larger and warmer. At the very same time, a prosperous urban middle class was steadily on the rise. Cities like Florence and London became bustling and crowded centers of immense wealth. This wealthy new class created a deep and abiding demand for personal privacy. They began the costly construction of large, multi-room houses. The clean, sharp smell of newly cut timber filled the winding city streets. Master carpenters worked endlessly to build private and secure bedchambers. The brilliant invention of the humble chimney changed domestic life entirely. It allowed large homes to be easily and safely divided into separate warm rooms. The soft, quiet draw of air flowed steadily up a newly constructed brick chimney. This simple and beautiful draft moved the central hearth away from the main living space. Families happily moved the private bedchamber away from the large and noisy communal hall. With this greatly increased privacy came a slow relaxation of the strict old ways. The intense and suffocating community surveillance began to softly fade away. The heavy, muffled silence of a private room provided deep psychological comfort. It was separated by a solid, thick wooden door rather than a thin, drafty curtain. The prying and judgmental eyes of the village could no longer see absolutely everything. The rigid and punishing penitential manuals of the 11th century slowly gathered dust. Late medieval theologians began to view them as overly harsh and cruel. They were seen as slightly outdated and totally out of touch with actual human reality. The fading, forgotten dust settled thickly on an ancient, unused book of penitential laws. The strict clerics were slowly losing their absolute grip on the intimate lives of the common people. Church courts still remained quite active across the sweeping lands, but they increasingly and pragmatically focused on formalizing legal contracts and property disputes. They stepped away from punishing the exhaustive and exhausting minutiae of domestic life. The world was slowly becoming a slightly more practical and forgiving place. Secular literature began to heavily flourish in this newly opened environment. Geoffrey Chaucer penned his incredibly famous and bawdy Canterbury Tales. The rhythmic, mechanical clacking of an early printing press began churning out secular poetry for the masses. These popular stories openly mocked the grand hypocrisy of wealthy and corrupt church officials. They celebrated bawdy and highly realistic human relationships with all their flaws. People desperately wanted to read about real life and real messy love. The legal concept of marriage began to slowly absorb the lofty ideals of courtly love. It began seamlessly merging the cold, old concept of duty with the warm new expectation of genuine romantic affection. By the late 15th century, the suffocating bureaucratic grip of the early medieval church had loosened greatly. It relaxed comfortably into a much more pragmatic and lived-in reality. This slow and steady cultural drift away from medieval bureaucracy was quiet but profound. It culminated in the explosive and permanent changes brought about by the Reformation in the 16th century. In fact, the absolute greatest upheaval was still quietly waiting to come. The Protestant Reformation arrived suddenly like a massive and destructive storm. It completely and utterly dismantled the old medieval Catholic framework of marriage. It fundamentally and forever changed the strict rules of romance and theology. In the early 16th century, Martin Luther and the Protestant reformers launched a massive theological assault. They struck bravely and fiercely at the very heart of Catholic doctrine. The sharp, resounding echo of a heavy metal hammer rang out loudly. It was driving a thick iron nail into a heavy wooden church door. The echoing sound rang out across all of human history. One of Luther's most significant and rebellious acts was redefining the sacred union of man and woman. He boldly and loudly declared that marriage was not a holy sacrament at all. Instead, he forcefully argued it was a purely worldly and civil institution. The crisp, clean scent of fresh black ink wafted gently from a newly printed vernacular Bible. The sacred words were now finally printed in the common language of the ordinary people. By completely removing its sacramental status, the reformers changed the law forever. They stripped the ancient Catholic Church of its absolute legal monopoly over marital affairs. Luther fiercely and publicly attacked the old medieval ideal of strict clerical celibacy. He believed it was a highly unnatural and totally unbiblical burden. He famously and happily led by example and married a former nun named Katharina von Bora. Together, they happily created a warm and deeply loving household. The fiery reformers then looked closely at the massive and confusing books of church law. They completely and entirely abolished the complex, suffocating laws of consanguinity. The quiet, profound tearing of an old papal decree of consanguinity could be heard in the mind. They permanently reduced the strict marriage prohibitions to only direct and very close family relations. The endless and confusing charts of seventh-degree cousins were finally thrown into the fire. The exhaustive and maddening calendar of forbidden days was also completely wiped away. Protestant theology viewed marital intimacy quite differently than the monks of old. They saw it as a completely natural and deeply unashamed part of daily life. It was a divine blessing to be fully enjoyed without constant and heavy guilt. For the first time in many long and dark centuries, absolute divorce was legally permitted. The legal right to fully remarry was granted safely in Protestant regions. This was usually permitted strictly on the tragic grounds of adultery or deep abandonment. The old and strange theological concept of the marital debt still remained in the texts, but it was gently and softly reframed by the new Protestant ministers. It became a mutually comforting and loving duty rather than a strict legal obligation. The warm, inviting glow of a crackling fire lit up a Protestant minister's family parlor. It was a beautiful scene of domestic peace and quiet harmony. Protestant theology placed immense and heavy emphasis on the tight nuclear family. They made the bustling household, rather than the quiet monastery, the true absolute center of moral life. The slow fading echo of ancient Latin chants drifted sadly away into the past. The chants were being entirely replaced by the spoken and comforting local languages of the people. In direct response to all this, the Catholic Church finally convened the Great Council of Trent. They firmly and stubbornly doubled down on the sacramental nature of holy marriage. But even they had to quietly admit the medieval bureaucracy had grown far too large. They finally and practically streamlined their own exhaustive and heavy bureaucratic processes. The total destruction of the old medieval system leaves us to pause and deeply reflect. What strange pieces of those bizarre regulations still linger quietly hidden in our modern world? The modern world is built entirely upon the ancient and hidden bones of the past. The lingering legacy of medieval regulations remains quietly with us today. The strict medieval requirement that marriages be publicly announced continues in many places. It survives today gently in the traditional reading of the banns in many quiet Anglican churches. The old rules still cast a very long and very quiet shadow over us all. The simple and beautiful exchange of rings is an ancient and profound echo. The specific placement of the ring on the fourth finger remains a direct continuation of the old medieval church door ceremonies. The soft, familiar click of a modern gold ring sliding onto a finger is a sound centuries old. The modern concept of needing a marriage license from a centralized authority also remains fully intact. This is simply a modern and polished evolution of the old church's strict insistence on legal registration. We still quietly seek permission to love from those holding power over us. Modern alimony and complex prenuptial agreements find their early legal roots in the distant past as well. They grew slowly from the meticulous and exhausting legal negotiations of the medieval dowry and dower. The quiet, distant fading of an ancient, forgotten memory slips softly into the mist of time. Even the joyous and relaxing honeymoon has deep historical roots in the medieval world. The cultural expectation that a honeymoon naturally follows a wedding stems from a very old tradition. It was originally a whole month spent drinking sweet honey wine known as mead. This was done to ensure basic health and abundant fertility for the new young couple. The gentle closing of a heavy leather-bound history book signals the quiet end of an era. While the old ecclesiastical body courts are long gone, the human conflicts remain the same. Modern family law courts still handle the exact same fundamental and tragic disputes today. They quietly mediate over broken promises and the endless varieties of domestic strife. Human nature, it seems, has not really changed at all over the centuries. The sweeping romantic ideals of the ancient troubadours still absolutely thrive today. Their grand themes of deep longing and absolute devotion and finding a true soulmate are everywhere around us. They remain the absolute and unshakable foundation of our modern pop music and our cinematic stories. We still unknowingly sing the heartfelt cansos of the distant past. The slow rhythmic ticking of a clock measures the silent and steady passage of centuries. The sheer oddity of the medieval calendar reminds modern historians of a profound and simple truth. Societal norms surrounding intimacy and love are highly fluid and never truly permanent. They are constantly evolving and slowly changing with the endless tides of time. Ultimately, the intense medieval obsession with regulating romance was a futile attempt at absolute control. It was a desperate effort to bring strict order to the unpredictable and chaotic nature of human emotion. Love has always been a wild and completely untamable thing. Studying these bizarre and ancient rules allows us a quiet moment of gratitude. It helps us deeply appreciate the profound and wonderful freedoms of the modern era. The deep, settling stillness of a vast library at midnight preserves the past safely in the dark. We live happily in a time where the state and the church no longer strictly dictate the calendar of the heart. And with that, the grand, complicated tapestry of medieval romance gently folds away into the archives of history. The kings, the clerics, and the peasants who navigated those bizarre rules have long since found their rest leaving behind only quiet echoes in our modern traditions. History is at its core simply the study of people trying to find their way in the dark, much like we all do at the end of a long day. If you are still awake and listening, let your mind drift away from the weight of history. We are going to spend our remaining time together simply listening to the quiet, soothing sounds of a medieval night, letting the ambience carry you gently across the threshold of sleep.